There are moments in life when a single scream can split a community in two. When Ngozi's voice pierced the silence of that rain-soaked night, neighbors rushed to their windows, hearts pounding, hands trembling as they pulled back curtains to see what had happened. What they witnessed would become the scandal that defined their small town for years to come. A woman, drenched and trembling, stood face to face with the man who had once called her daughter. But the look in his eyes that night held something else entirely. Something desperate, something forbidden, something that would shatter every assumption they had ever made about love, loyalty, and the dangerous hunger of loneliness. This is the true story of how grief can blur the lines we once thought were sacred, and how one woman's courage in the face of shame would teach an entire community what forgiveness really means. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Ngozi was the kind of woman people noticed not because she demanded attention, but because grace seemed to follow her wherever she went. In the small town on the outskirts of Enugu, where red dust coated everything by midday and gossip traveled faster than the morning breeze, she had built a reputation as a teacher who genuinely cared. Her students loved her patient explanations and the way she never raised her voice, even when they forgot their homework for the third time that week. She wore her hair in neat braids that she redid every 2 weeks without fail, and her smile had a way of making even the strictest market women soften when she bargained for tomatoes. She was 28 years old when this story truly began, though the seeds of what would happen had been planted long before she realized it. Chief Okafor was what people in the community called a proper elder, not just in age, but in the respect he commanded whenever he walked into a room. He had been a widower for over 20 years, ever since his young wife died during childbirth, taking with her not just his heart but also the daughter he had prayed for. His only child, Kelechi, survived and became both his pride and his unspoken disappointment. The chief was a man of few words and careful gestures, known for settling disputes in the community with wisdom that seemed carved from decades of quiet observation. His compound was modest but well-kept, with flowers his late wife had planted still blooming every rainy season as if her hands still tended them. He rarely spoke about her, but everyone knew that the white cloth he wore on special occasions had belonged to her, the same cloth she wore on the day she died. People respected his grief the way you respect a wound that never quite heals, by not asking too many questions. Kelechi, his son, was everything his father was not. Where Chief Okafor moved with deliberate slowness, Kelechi rushed through life as if something was always chasing him. He worked as a mechanic in town, and his hands were always stained with grease that never quite washed off, even on Sundays when he sat in church beside Ngozi. He had a restless energy that made him tap his feet during sermons and check his phone during family dinners, always looking for something just beyond his reach. When he and Ngozi first met at a church youth program 7 years ago, his intensity felt like passion. She mistook his inability to sit still for ambition, his constant dissatisfaction for drive. They married young, in a ceremony that Chief Okafor funded entirely, tears streaming down his face as he watched his son take a wife. The old man had whispered to Ngozi that day, gripping her hand with surprising strength, "If Kelechi ever hurts you, heaven itself will answer to me." She had laughed it off then, thinking it was just the emotional promise of a father moved by the occasion. But heaven, as Ngozi would later learn, does not always intervene the way we expect it to. The first year of marriage was everything she had prayed for. Laughter in the kitchen, plans whispered in the dark, dreams that felt within reach. Kelechi would come home smelling of motor oil and exhaustion, but he would still find energy to dance with her to the radio while she cooked. Chief Okafor visited them often, always bringing fruit from the market or a little extra money tucked into an envelope, saying it was just to help them settle. He treated Ngozi with a tenderness that made her ache for the father she had lost when she was 12. She began to think of the chief's compound as her true home, more so than the cramped room she and Kelechi rented near his workshop. Life felt complete, or at least complete enough. But completeness, she would discover, is often just the calm before something inside begins to crack. The unraveling started so slowly that Ngozi almost missed it. Kelechi began coming home later, his excuses growing thinner with each passing week. A customer needed urgent repairs. A friend had an emergency. The workshop was behind on orders. She wanted to believe him because the alternative was a suspicion too painful to name. She started noticing the small things, the way he showered immediately when he got home, as if washing away evidence. The cheap perfume that clung to his collar, a scent nothing like hers. The way his phone was suddenly password protected after years of being carelessly left on the table. She tried everything she knew. Cooking his favorite meals, dressing the way he used to like, praying fervently at dawn when the world was still quiet. She fasted for 3 days, believing that if she could just be better, holier, more patient, he would come back to her. But faith, she learned, cannot fix what someone else has chosen to break. Chief Okafor noticed the change before Ngozi admitted it to herself. He would visit and find her eyes red from crying, though she always claimed it was just exhaustion from work. He would ask about Kelechi with a father's concern, and she would lie with a wife's loyalty, saying everything was fine. But the old man was not fooled. One evening, he sat her down after Kelechi had left for yet another late-night errand and said something that chilled her. "My son has his father's face but his mother's weakness for running when things get hard." She did not understand what he meant then, but she would remember those words later when everything made terrible sense. The chief began stopping by more often, not to see his son, but to check on her. He would bring her small gifts, a bag of rice, money for her transportation, sometimes just his presence and a listening ear. It felt like comfort, like the fatherly protection she had lost years ago. She did not see the danger in accepting it because she could not imagine that comfort could ever turn into something else. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Ngozi was grading papers at the small table in their room. Kelechi walked in with a duffel bag already packed. His face set in a way that told her this was not a discussion but an announcement. He was going to Lagos, he said. Business opportunity. A friend had connections. He would send money. He did not meet her eyes when he said it, and that was how she knew he was lying. She asked how long he would be gone, and he said maybe a month, maybe longer. She asked if he was leaving her, and he said no, but his silence afterwards screamed yes louder than any argument ever could. He left before noon, and she stood in the doorway watching his retreating back until he disappeared around the corner. She did not cry immediately. The tears came later, in the middle of the night when she realized that he had taken his toothbrush but left his wedding ring on the bedside table. It was the small detail that broke her. Not the leaving, but the deliberate removal of a symbol that once meant forever. Chief Okafor found her 3 days later, still in the same clothes, the room a mess of unwashed dishes and unanswered questions. He did not ask what happened because he already knew. His son had called him from Lagos, confessing everything with the careless honesty of someone who no longer cared about the wreckage left behind. There was another woman. There had been for months. Kelechi was not coming back. The chief held Ngozi while she sobbed, his old hands patting her back with a gentleness that felt like the only solid thing in her collapsing world. He told her she could stay in the family compound, that she was still his daughter no matter what his fool of a son had done. She believed him because she needed to believe someone, because the alternative was admitting she had nowhere else to go. So she moved into the small guest room in Chief Okafor's compound, telling herself it was temporary, just until she figured things out. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you are too broken to see the future clearly. The divorce papers arrived 6 months later, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be handing over such a document. Kelechi had not even had the decency to come back and face her. He sent legal papers and a check that was supposed to represent 3 years of marriage, as if heartbreak could be calculated and compensated. Ngozi signed them with a hand that did not shake because by then, she had cried every tear her body could produce. She was numb in the way that trauma creates. Not peaceful but absent, like a house after everyone has moved out. Chief Okafor stood beside her when she signed, his presence a silent promise that she was not alone. And in that moment, gratitude and grief became so tangled in her heart that she could not tell where one ended and the other began. What would you have done if someone abandoned you like this? Would you have stayed in that compound? Or would you have run far away while you still could? The shift happened so gradually that Ngozi could not pinpoint exactly when fatherly concern became something else entirely. Chief Okafor had always been attentive, but after the divorce, his attention became a constant presence she could not escape. He would knock on her door each evening to ask if she had eaten, and when she said yes, he would bring food anyway, saying she looked too thin, too tired, too sad. He began complimenting her in ways that made her uncomfortable. Not crude comments, but observations that lingered too long. He would say things like, "You have your mother-in-law's eyes, you know. She had the kindest eyes I ever saw." Or, "That dress brings out something in you. My wife used to wear white like that." At first, Ngozi dismissed it as an old man's nostalgia, his grief finding strange expression through the woman living in his compound. But then his hand would linger on hers when he handed her something, just a second too long, and she would feel a cold knot form in her stomach. He started sending the housemaids away whenever he visited her room, claiming he wanted to talk privately about family matters. These conversations would stretch longer and longer, his chair inching closer to hers with each visit. He would talk about his late wife with a rawness that made Ngozi's skin prickle, how she smelled like coconut oil and laughter, how her absence left a hole in him that never closed, how some nights he woke up reaching for her across the bed only to find emptiness. Ngozi listened because she thought this was grief, this was pain she could understand. This was a man who needed someone to witness his suffering. She did not realize that in witnessing it, she was becoming the object onto which he projected his unfulfilled longing. He began bringing her gifts that felt too personal, expensive wrappers, gold jewelry, envelopes of money that were far more than she needed. When she tried to refuse, he would insist with a hurt expression that made her feel guilty for setting boundaries. How do you reject kindness from someone who saved you when you had nothing? The night everything changed. Ngozi had returned from a late staff meeting at school, exhausted and wanting nothing more than to sleep. She found Chief Okafor waiting on her veranda, sitting in the darkness as if he had been there for hours. When she asked if everything was okay, he stood and moved closer, his breathing heavy in the humid night air. He told her that he had been thinking about traveling to a wherry for a family meeting and wanted her to come with him. She politely declined, saying it would not be appropriate since she was no longer married to his son. That was when his face changed, not angry, but desperate in a way that frightened her. He reached for her hand and held it between both of his grip firm but not violent, his voice dropping to something almost pleading. He said words that would echo in her mind for months afterward. "Ngozi, it is not a sin for two lonely souls to find comfort in each other. Even the Bible says it is not good for man to be alone." The silence that followed those words felt like the air had been sucked out of the night. Ngozi pulled her hand away, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. This was Chief Okafor, the man who had blessed her marriage, who had called her his daughter, who had promised to protect her. And now he stood before her suggesting something that violated every boundary she thought existed between them. She stammered an excuse about being tired and fled into her room, locking the door with shaking hands. She sat on her bed in the darkness, listening to his footsteps eventually retreat, trying to convince herself that she had misunderstood. But deep down, she knew exactly what he meant. The man who had been her refuge had become her danger, and she was trapped in his compound with nowhere to run. Do you think she should have left immediately? Or was it reasonable to hope this was just a moment of confusion that would pass? The obsession intensified over the following weeks. Chief Okafor began making his intentions clearer, no longer hiding behind metaphors and implications. He would tell her outright that he wanted to marry her, that he could give her the stability and respect that his useless son never provided. He painted a picture of their life together. She would be a woman of status as his wife, respected in the community, financially secure, never having to worry again. He was not a young man, he admitted, but his love was real, his intentions honorable. Could she not see that they were meant to comfort each other? Every conversation became a negotiation she never agreed to participate in. Every kindness a debt he seemed to think she owed him. Ngozi felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller and quieter, afraid that any word she spoke might be twisted into encouragement. She stopped eating properly because meals felt like opportunities for him to corner her in the kitchen. She stopped sleeping well because she feared the sound of footsteps approaching her door at night. She confided in her pastor, a gentle man who had counseled her through her divorce. He listened with a grave expression, prayed over her, and then gave her advice that crushed what little hope she had left. He told her to be careful how she refused Chief Okafor because powerful men in small communities do not take rejection lightly. He suggested she be patient, be prayerful, and perhaps consider that God works in mysterious ways. The implication was clear. Even the church would not protect her if it meant confronting a man of Chief Okafor's standing. Ngozi left that office feeling more alone than ever, understanding that the institutions she had trusted to safeguard her were more interested in maintaining peace than ensuring her safety. She was a divorced woman living in her ex-father-in-law's compound, and in the eyes of many, whatever happened to her was somehow a consequence of choices she must have made. The weight of that judgment, that abandonment by her own community, was almost heavier than the harassment itself. In desperation, Ngozi did something she swore she would never do. She wrote to Kelechi. The letter was short, stripped of pride, just a factual account of what his father was doing and a plea for him to come home and intervene. She sent it to the Lagos address he had left behind, not knowing if he would even receive it, much less care enough to respond. Weeks passed with no reply, and Ngozi felt herself running out of options. She could not afford to rent her own place on a teacher's salary. She had no family close enough to take her in. Every path forward seemed blocked, every door closed. She began to understand how people get trapped, not always by chains and locks, but by circumstances that slowly tighten around you until you cannot remember what freedom felt like. And through it all, Chief Okafor continued his pursuit with the relentless patience of someone who believed that time and persistence would eventually wear down her resistance. The rain started just after midnight, the kind of downpour that turns roads into rivers and makes the world feel like it is drowning. Ngozi lay awake in her room, listening to water drum against the metal roof, wondering how much more of this life she could endure. She had been avoiding Chief Okafor for 3 days straight, eating meals in her room, leaving for school before dawn and returning after dark. But avoidance, she was learning, was not the same as escape. She heard the footsteps on her veranda before she saw the shadow move past her window. Her first thought was panic. Had he finally decided to force the issue, to stop asking and start demanding? She considered pretending to be asleep, but the knock that came was so desperate, so broken, that something in her could not ignore it. When she opened the door, Chief Okafor stood there drenched, his clothes plastered to his elderly frame, his face streaked with rain and something else. Tears, she realized with shock. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like the storm had washed away whatever dignity or authority he usually carried. Before she could speak, he collapsed to his knees on her wet veranda, his hands clasped in front of him in a gesture of supplication that looked obscene coming from a man of his age and status. His voice cracked when he spoke, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperation. Ngozi, I cannot fight this anymore. I have tried to be strong, tried to bury these feelings, but I am an old man and I am tired of being alone. If loving you is madness, then let madness take me. I am begging you, do not let me die without knowing what it means to feel alive again. Ngozi stood frozen, horror and pity warring inside her chest. This was not the Chief Okafor she knew, the dignified elder, the respected community leader. This was a man unraveled by loneliness so profound it had eaten away at his sense of propriety, his understanding of appropriate boundaries. She wanted to feel only anger, only revulsion, but what she felt was more complicated. A terrible empathy for the kind of isolation that could drive someone to this, mixed with absolute clarity that empathy did not mean she owed him anything. She tried to pull him to his feet, begging him to stop, to go inside and get dry, to please just let this go. But as she reached for his arm, he grabbed her wrist. Not violently, not with force meant to harm, but with the desperate grip of a drowning man reaching for anything that might save him. That was the moment the first neighbor's light came on. Then another, and another. Windows opened, curtains shifted, and suddenly Ngozi understood that this private nightmare was about to become public spectacle. She pulled away from his grip and stepped back into her doorway, watching as Chief Okafor seemed to realize what had happened, his face shifting from desperation to horror as he saw the growing audience. He stumbled to his feet and disappeared into the rain, leaving Ngozi standing in her doorway, trembling, knowing that by morning, this story would have grown wings and flown to every corner of the town. She closed her door and sank to the floor, understanding that regardless of what had actually happened, regardless of her innocence, the scandal would define her. In a small town, perception is reality, and perception had just destroyed whatever remained of her reputation. By noon the next day, the story had mutated into something unrecognizable. The version spreading through the market claimed that Ngozi had seduced Chief Okafor using charms bought from a herbalist. Another version insisted she had been sleeping with him all along, that the divorce from Kelechi had been a setup so she could marry the wealthier father. Some said she was a gold digger who had planned this from the beginning, deliberately breaking up the family so she could climb the social ladder. The cruelest version suggested that she was cursed, that any man who came near her would lose his mind, that she carried misfortune in her very presence. Ngozi heard these whispers every time she walked to school, saw the way women pulled their children away from her, as if divorce and desperation were contagious diseases. The worst part was not the strangers who judged her, but the people she had considered friends. Her fellow teachers began eating lunch without inviting her, their laughter dying when she entered the staff room. The pastor who had counseled her now avoided eye contact during services, as if her presence in church was itself scandalous. Market women who used to greet her warmly now served her in cold silence, making her feel like she was contaminating their goods just by touching them. Even her students sensed something had changed. They were quieter in her class, their parents suddenly questioning why she was teaching their children, as if knowledge delivered by a woman with a ruined reputation might somehow corrupt their innocence. Ngozi found herself moving through the town like a ghost, present but unseen, speaking but unheard, existing in a state of social death that felt worse than actual dying. Chief Okafor, meanwhile, retreated into his compound, refusing visitors and sending intermediaries to handle his community responsibilities. The few people who saw him said he looked unwell, as if shame had manifested as physical illness. But even in his absence, his power protected him in ways it never protected Ngozi. Men in the community spoke of him with sympathy. The poor man lost his mind over a woman, they said, as if desire absolved him of responsibility. He was grieving, they explained, lonely, confused in his old age. These same men showed no such grace to Ngozi. She was the temptation, the problem, the source of disruption that needed to be removed so peace could return. The double standard was so blatant it would have been laughable if it were not destroying her life. She understood then what women before her had always known, that society will forgive men almost anything while holding women accountable for simply existing in spaces where men's feelings become inconvenient. Ngozi seriously considered leaving, packing the few things she owned and disappearing to another state where nobody knew her story. But pride, stubborn and perhaps foolish, kept her rooted. Why should she run when she had done nothing wrong? Why should she lose her job, her students, her entire life because a man could not control his loneliness? She decided to stay, to endure, to wait for vindication that might never come. It was during this period of isolation that the letter arrived from Lagos, delivered by a courier service with Kelechi's name on the return address. Her hands shook as she opened it, not sure whether to expect apology, accusation, or indifference. What she found instead was something she had not anticipated, an explanation that reframed everything she thought she understood about Chief Okafor's obsession. Kelechi's letter was brief, written in the rushed handwriting of someone who was uncomfortable with emotional honesty. He started with a perfunctory apology for how he had ended their marriage, claiming the coward's excuse of not knowing how to face her. Then he addressed why he was writing now, after months of silence. Chief Okafor had called him, he explained, sounding confused and unwell, rambling about Ngozi in ways that frightened Kelechi enough to finally pay attention. During that conversation, his father had said something that made Kelechi realize what was truly happening. The old man had whispered, "She has your mother's eyes. She moves like your mother moved, and when she wears white, for a moment I forget that I am alone. Kelechi wrote that he finally understood what he should have seen all along. His father was not lusting after Ngozi, he was hallucinating his dead wife's presence through her. His grief so old and so deep that it had curdled into something dangerous and delusional. The letter went on to explain things Ngozi had never known. Chief Okafor's wife had not just died in childbirth. She had died because of the chief's decision. When complications arose during labor, there had been a choice between saving the mother or the child. The chief, desperate for a son after years of trying, had chosen the child. His wife had died knowing he valued the baby's life over hers. Her last words a whispered question. "Did you ever really love me?" The chief had lived with that guilt for over 20 years, talking to his dead wife's photograph every night, sleeping on one side of the bed as if she might return, keeping her clothes exactly as she had left them. Kelechi wrote that he grew up in a house haunted by a ghost his father could not let go, and he had run away, to marriage, to other women, to Lagos, trying to escape the suffocating grief that filled every corner of their compound. Ngozi read the letter 3 times, trying to absorb what it meant. The man who had been pursuing her was not seeing her at all. He was seeing a memory, a chance to rewrite his greatest regret, an opportunity to care for the woman he had failed to save decades ago. Her kindness, her presence in his home, her vulnerability after the divorce. All of it had triggered something in his traumatized mind, convincing him that if he could protect her, cherish her, make her happy, he might somehow atone for the choice that had haunted him for 20 years. It did not excuse what he had done. His pain did not give him the right to trap her, to pursue her, to make her life a nightmare. But it explained it in a way that was heartbreaking rather than evil, tragic rather than malicious. Ngozi sat with that letter for hours, feeling her anger slowly transform into something more complicated. A grief for 2 broken people whose wounds had collided in the most destructive way possible. She decided she needed to see him one last time, not for his sake, but for her own closure. She needed to look him in the eye and tell him that his guilt was not hers to heal, that his loneliness was not her responsibility, that she forgave him but she would not sacrifice herself on the altar of his regret. She walked to the main house, finding it eerily quiet, the compound that had once bustled with life now feeling abandoned. A housemaid answered her knock, her eyes widening in surprise, and informed her that Chief Okafor had been bedridden for days, refusing food, seeing no one. The housemaid looked at Ngozi with something like accusation, as if she were the cause of his decline. But Ngozi walked past her, down the dim corridor to the room she had never entered. The master bedroom where the chief had slept alone for 2 decades, where his wife's photographs still watched from every wall. He looked smaller in the bed, diminished by illness and shame. When he saw her, tears immediately filled his eyes, his hand reaching out in a gesture that was purely instinctive. Ngozi did not take it, but she sat in the chair beside his bed, keeping a careful distance. His voice, when he finally spoke, was weak and rasping. "I thought if I loved you well enough, she would forgive me. I thought if I could keep you safe, it would mean I learned something from losing her. I saw her in you, not because you look alike, but because you were kind when you had every reason not to be, and that was how she loved me, even when I did not deserve it. I am sorry, Ngozi. I lost my way. I mistook grief for love and loneliness for destiny. Please do not hate me when I am gone." Ngozi listened, her heart aching not with romantic pity, but with the profound sadness of witnessing a life consumed by regret. She told him gently but firmly that she forgave him, but that forgiveness did not mean what he had done was acceptable. She hoped he would find peace, but she would not be the instrument of that peace. Then she stood and walked out of his life for the last time. Chief Okafor died 2 weeks later, quietly in his sleep, without fanfare or final dramatic speeches. The funeral was well attended because community respect for the dead outweighs scandal involving the living. Ngozi did not attend, knowing her presence would only revive gossip and distract from whatever dignity his memory deserved. But 3 days after his burial, his lawyer contacted her. The chief had left her something in his will, not money or property, but a letter written in his own hand during his final days. She opened it in private, bracing herself for more confessions or apologies she did not need. What she found instead was something unexpected. Wisdom born from suffering, clarity that apparently only comes when death is imminent. The letter began with an apology, but not the kind that sought absolution. He wrote that he was sorry for making his emotional survival her responsibility, for confusing his need with her obligation, for believing that his pain gave him permission to disregard her boundaries. He acknowledged that loneliness is a dangerous hunger that can make good people do terrible things, that grief unprocessed becomes a poison that contaminates everything it touches. He wrote that he spent 20 years creating a shrine to his dead wife instead of building a life worth living, and in doing so, he had become a cautionary tale about the difference between honoring memory and being imprisoned by it. The most striking part of the letter was his final paragraph, where he wrote directly to her about the rumors and judgment she had endured. They will say you did something to deserve this attention. They will question your character, your motives, your worth. Do not let them. When someone crosses a line, it is their failure, not yours. And when grief makes someone lose their way, compassion is noble but self-sacrifice is not required. Forgive me if you can, but more importantly, forgive yourself for anything you think you should have done differently. You survived something you should never have had to survive. Ngozi kept that letter for years, reading it whenever self-doubt crept in. Whenever she wondered if maybe she had somehow caused the situation by being too kind, too available, too unwilling to be cruel even when cruelty might have protected her. The letter became her evidence that even the person who hurt her understood that the blame belonged to him alone. But the letter was not enough to restore her reputation in the town. Gossip has a longer lifespan than truth, and people preferred the dramatic story of seduction and scandal to the complicated reality of trauma and boundaries violated. So 6 months after Chief Okafor's death, Ngozi made the decision she had resisted for so long. She left. Not in shame or defeat, but as a deliberate choice to build a life somewhere that did not define her by the worst thing that had happened to her. She took a teaching position in a small village 3 hours away, a place where nobody knew her story and she could simply be Ngozi the teacher, not Ngozi the scandal. She threw herself into her work with renewed purpose, not trying to forget what happened, but refusing to let it be the only thing that defined her. She started a mentorship program for young women, teaching them not just academics but life skills, how to recognize manipulation disguised as care, how to set boundaries even with people they respect, how to leave situations that make them feel unsafe even when everyone else insists they should stay. She spoke openly about her experience, not for sympathy, but as testimony that survival is possible, that shame is a weapon others use against you, but you do not have to pick it up and carry it yourself. In sharing her story, she found purpose beyond her own pain. She became a voice for every woman who had been blamed for the unwanted attention of men, for every person told their discomfort was less important than keeping peace. Years later, long after she had rebuilt her life, Ngozi would reflect on that chapter with a clarity that only distance provides. She understood now that Chief Okafor's loneliness was real, but it was not her responsibility to fix. His grief was valid, but it did not justify his actions. His final growth and self-awareness were admirable, but they did not erase the harm he caused. She learned that forgiveness does not require forgetting, that moving on does not mean pretending something did not matter, that healing is not about reconciliation with those who hurt you but about reclaiming the parts of yourself that trauma tried to steal. She also learned something about community, that institutions and people who should protect you will often choose comfort over justice, that standing alone with integrity is better than standing with a crowd that demands you shrink yourself for their peace of mind. The experience made her both softer and harder, more compassionate toward human weakness, more uncompromising about her own boundaries. So let me ask you something. If you were in Ngozi's position, what would you have done? Would you have left immediately when Chief Okafor first crossed the line? Or would you have stayed hoping things would improve? Would you have forgiven him after reading his final letter? Or would your anger have been too great for compassion? These are not easy questions, and there are no perfect answers. Life is complicated, people are messy, and sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones between bad options and worse options. What I hope you take from Ngozi's story is not just sympathy for what she endured, but recognition of the systems and assumptions that made her endurance necessary. How many people in your own life are trapped by circumstances we judge without understanding? How many times have you seen someone blamed for the inappropriate behavior of another? When have you chosen comfortable silence over uncomfortable truth? The greatest lesson from this story is not about forgiveness or moving on, though both have their place. It is about the responsibility we all carry to create communities where people like Ngozi do not have to choose between homelessness and harassment, where pastors prioritize victim safety over powerful men's reputations, where divorced women are not automatically considered available or responsible for male attention. It is about recognizing that loneliness and grief, however real, never justify making someone else feel unsafe. And it is about understanding that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is leave. Not because you are giving up, but because you are choosing yourself. Ngozi chose herself eventually, and in doing so she became a testament to the fact that your worst chapter does not have to be your final one. This story sits with me because it challenges simple narratives. We want villains and heroes, clear lines between good and evil, easy answers about who deserves our sympathy. But Chief Okafor was not a monster. He was a man destroyed by guilt and isolation who made choices that hurt someone innocent. Ngozi was not a perfect victim. She stayed longer than perhaps she should have, made decisions others might question, but she was doing the best she could with limited options and overwhelming pressure. Real life rarely offers the moral clarity we crave. What it offers instead is the opportunity to learn from complexity, to extend grace without excusing harm, to acknowledge pain without weaponizing it. The question is not whether Chief Okafor's suffering was real. It was. The question is whether his suffering entitled him to create suffering in someone else. And the answer unequivocally is no. If the story has touched something in you, if it made you think differently about loneliness, boundaries, or the weight women carry when they are blamed for existing in spaces where men's emotions become inconvenient, then share it. Not because it is entertaining, but because these conversations matter. Someone watching this right now might be in a similar situation, trapped by kindness they cannot refuse, blamed for attention they never sought, wondering if they are overreacting to behavior everyone else seems willing to excuse. Let them hear Ngozi's story and know they are not alone, that their discomfort is valid, that leaving is not weakness but wisdom. Let them understand that other people's loneliness, however profound, is not their cross to bear. Before you go, I want you to consider one more thing. Chief Okafor's wife died decades before this story began, but in many ways, she was the ghost that haunted every moment of it. Her death created his guilt created his obsession, and his obsession nearly destroyed Ngozi. Unresolved grief is like that. It does not stay contained, it seeps out and touches everyone around it, sometimes in ways that cause harm generations later. If you are carrying grief, pain, or regret that you have never properly processed, please do not let it fester until it becomes something poisonous. Seek help, talk to someone, find healthy ways to honor what you lost without letting it consume what remains. The people around you should not have to pay the price for wounds that were never theirs to heal. That is not wisdom from a perfect person, but from someone who has witnessed what happens when pain is left unattended for too long. Ngozi's story does not end with Chief Okafor's death or even with her moving away. It continues in the young women she mentors, the boundaries she teaches them to guard, the voices she empowers to speak even when speaking is dangerous. It continues in her refusal to be defined by trauma, her insistence on writing her own narrative rather than accepting the one gossip assigned to her. Years after leaving that town, she married again. A quiet man who respected her past without needing to fix it, who understood that her strength came not from never being broken, but from the deliberate work of putting herself back together. She had children and told them her story when they were old enough to understand nuance, teaching them that forgiveness and boundaries can coexist, that compassion does not require self-destruction. She lived a full life, rich with meaning and purpose, proving that one terrible chapter does not have to poison the entire book. The last time anyone from her old town saw her, she was giving a speech at a women's conference about recognizing emotional manipulation before it escalates. Someone asked her if she ever regretted staying in Chief Okafor's compound as long as she did, if she blamed herself for not seeing the signs sooner. Her answer was simple and profound. I do not spend energy regretting survival strategies that got me through impossible situations. I was doing the best I could with the information and resources I had. Anyone who judges those choices from the safety of distance has never truly understood what it means to be trapped. That response, more than anything else, captures who Ngozi became. A woman who refused to carry shame that belonged to others, who transformed her pain into pedagogy, who understood that the most powerful form of healing is helping others avoid the wounds you endured. So as we close the story, I leave you with the question Ngozi herself asks at the end of her talks. Who in your life needs permission to leave a situation that looks fine from the outside but feels suffocating from the inside? Maybe it is you. Maybe it is someone you know. Whoever it is, let Ngozi's story be that permission. You do not owe anyone your peace, your safety, or your sanity just because they are lonely, just because they have suffered, just because refusing them feels unkind. Kindness that costs you your well-being is not kindness. It is self-destruction dressed in virtue. And you deserve better than that. We all do. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see something differently, let us know in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from and what part of Ngozi's journey resonated most with you. Do you think she forgave Chief Okafor too easily? Or was her grace a form of strength? Would you have handled things differently? These conversations matter because they help us all think more deeply about the unspoken rules and expectations that shape our choices. And please, subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories we tell. Stories about real people navigating impossible situations. Stories that refuse easy answers. Stories that honor the complexity of being human in a world that constantly demands we simplify ourselves into categories of good or bad, victim or villain, strong or weak. Next time, we will tell you about a widow who discovered her late husband's secret second family, and how instead of destroying them in revenge, she did something that changed all their lives in ways nobody expected. It is a story about grief, betrayal, and the surprising ways love can be redefined when everything you thought you knew turns out to be a lie. You will not want to miss it. Until then, remember Ngozi's most important lesson. Surviving something difficult does not make you damaged. It makes you someone who knows the value of peace, the necessity of boundaries, and the courage it takes to choose yourself even when the whole world is telling you to sacrifice for the comfort of others. That is not selfishness. That is wisdom. And the world needs more people brave enough to live by it. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourself. And remember to subscribe.